This is Adrenaline Radio. You're listening to Adrenaline Motorsports. I'm your host. This is 1680 AM on your dial. And wanted to talk to you folks tonight about actually the review a little bit of what we spoke about last week. I mentioned a little bit about the Bonneville car and the project and what it took to get to that point. And in the process of all that, I happened to think about, how did all this happen? How did it all get here from day one, and how in the early stages of your life, basically the people you meet and what you run across and who you run across and who you meet and how all that occurred. And I got to thinking about that, and I made a few notes, and I wanted to touch a little bit on this subject just to kind of bring everybody in a direction here. Living in Southern California, first of all, is quite an adventure in itself. There's so many things to see, places to go, and things to do. But in the early days, when I was growing up as a teenager and then a young adult, the things that we had basically with the people that I started associating with was all based around the automotive, the cars, the street rods per se, if you will. First, it was started from high school, taking auto shop and meeting some of the guys, and then they were talking about places they would meet after school and in the evenings and on the weekends and things of that nature. And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, well, because of this thing that we did in the early days was instrumental in what I do today and my involvement with the people that I have had on the show as guests, and the fact that I know these people, and I took it all for granted that I really didn't have, I guess I have been in a special place if you're dealing with motorsports especially, that there's a lot of neat people that we've run across in our lives, and they were basically pretty much had an effect on what I do today. And I talked to you last week about my Bonneville project and the people I met and what we had to do about getting parts for the transmission and getting it rebuilt and going to the different shops and visiting some of the different engine builders such as My Tech Race Engine. And I found that that was all stemmed from the early days. Like Mr. Mike Lefever's, he had an uncle who was a early drag racer back in the 50s and 60s, and this is kind of how this all evolved from that. And but a little bit of my history was when I right at high school. There were places we went to were the drive-ins. When I say drive-ins, I'm talking about food places, eateries. They would have car hops there, and that was a gathering place for guys and seeing their cars, and some of them had real nice cars, and some of them were hopped up, and they were hot rods basically is what it was all about. And pretty much if one wanted to compare something and see it today, there was a movie made called American Graffiti, and it was very similar. I mean, some of it was obviously based around the movie and that type of thing, but those gathering places were real. They really did happen, and this was back in the 50s and 60s. They started to diminish a little bit, but in the 50s we did have places just like that. I mean, I had pretty much when in my late teens I went to a drive-in there in Inglewood, California, called Scrivener's, and that was on Tuesday nights. And sure enough, the serious hot rodders showed up at that place, and the intent of those hot rodders were to run their cars in secluded areas of the city. And in this particular location, they went out to an area in South Broadway. Again, this is living in Los Angeles and having places to go, and this is what they did. And they, as you saw, they had parked their cars in a certain angled direction, and they would then have the contestants down at the other end, and they'd start up and they'd come flying by you, and it was about a quarter mile, half a mile possibly, but they were running their cars. And then other places that we go to just to see where there were other cars gathering, and there was a place called the Witch Stand. It was on Slauson Avenue there at Stalker, which is again in Los Angeles. And then This is kind of on the west side of town, and then there was the Clock Drive-In and on Venice Boulevard, and so these were the places that people were gathering. They were really into cars. They were into food, and of course they had the car hops there, serving you a sandwich or whatever with trays, and all that was the real deal. That was kind of how all this began. But in the same process, we had met a lot of neat guys that had the cars, and we would learn how to fix these cars. And in my case, I was fortunate enough to acquire a 1932 coupe, a 5-window coupe, chop top, and it had Evans heads on it and dual carburetors, and that was my hot rod. Of course, you go to a car show today like the Grand National Roadster Show, and what resembles the hot rod I had was what they call today a rat rod, which was a primered vehicle with all of that kind of paraphernalia on there, the heads and the ignition and open wheels and that type of thing. Well, those are the kind of cars that were on the street back in the late 50s. As time moved forward, pretty much we got a little more serious about this race thing, and I got to meet people. There was an example. There was a garage in the neighborhood, and it was owned by a family called Paisano Brothers, and they had a big deal with their operation was that they did engine swaps. They would put Cadillacs in Fords, and they would put GMC engines in the early 37 coupes and things like that, and this was the beginning of the hot rod center. It wasn't sophisticated as you see today, like SoCal Speed Shop is, that when you go out you have a chassis built, that type of thing. Well, this was the beginnings of all that. They took standard automotive engines and installed them in early model cars, and they would really, like overhead engines in the 1940 Ford Coupe. That was a big deal. I had a friend who had a Buick engine in his 40 Coupe, and another one had a Cadillac in his 40 Coupe. But these were the guys you would meet at these drive-ins, and I thought that was a pretty good thing. And that was my beginnings of meeting people who would later in life would be in business. And that was kind of some of the things that affected my lifestyles per se. I mean, I got into the cars and started buying cars that they weren't junkers, but they were nice cars that I would like to have. And of course, I had the champagne taste, but the Kool-Aid income, and that was kind of how we had it in those days. And I would have enough parts to build at least what I wanted to run during that day. As it evolved, more drive-ins, as I say, were out there in the area. We went later in the Glendale, Burbank area. There were drive-ins like Bob's Toluca Lake, by the way, which still exists today as a drive-in, and cars do gather there. And I think there's a car club still hangs out there called the Road Kings. I think that's what you see there on Friday nights, if I'm not mistaken. But there were other drive-ins in that same area. There was Vandy Camps, where they used to have the Vandy Camp Bakery, but they also had a drive-in restaurant. You could go in there and get a meal with your girlfriend and that type of thing. And that was really a neat deal. It was really a lot of fun.